my mission is making sure that millennials and Gen Zs can change their trajectory and that they can become homeowners, because I think right now they are feeling like that Australian dream is slipping away. Yeah. So if we don't do nothing, we will guarantee that the Australian dream will die for millennials and Gen Zs, and certainly under the current Labor government, that's the trajectory we're on.
Home ownership is one of the biggest issues facing our nation. An individual's home ownership status is the primary determinant of retirement outcomes, not your superannuation balance. Our guest today believes in innovative housing policies that support home ownership across all demographics. Senator Andrew Bragg, welcome on. How you doing?
Aaron, how are you?
I'm fantastic, thank you. Look, we had the pleasure of meeting, we were just speaking before about a roundtable, industry roundtable down in Kiama, which you chaired. It was fantastic. I think I walked away with a feeling of, hey, here's someone that genuinely, one, has skin in the game from a housing affordability, home ownership and housing affordability perspective, but also the different seats at the table. We had builders, we had finance, we had town planning, for example, community consultation, targeting the issue, which is housing affordability and home ownership, is not an easy problem to solve. I'm glad it's in your remit and not mine.
Yeah.
And I mean, you've, as being in politics, it's almost like, is this something that gets handballed across to politicians? This is all the conversations we're going to have today. I know you've had a background in working Ernst & Young, I believe, and you've made the transition across to politics. What do you love about the role?
Well, it's a great opportunity to help people and to try and solve complex problems. And right now, as you know, we're looking at a whole generation of Australians missing out on home ownership. And that would fundamentally change the character of Australia, because since the Second World War, we've always been a country where people own a house in the main. What that means is that people have a greater stake in the society. And if we lose that, then Australia won't be the same Australia. So right now, I'm trying to do everything I can to change course so that millennials, Gen Zs can own a house in Australia. So that's my mission right now.
Fantastic. I mean, music to a lot of people's ears, right? I mean, parents are very concerned about their kids getting to the market. You mentioned there's Gen Zs, millennials that feel like they've lost a little bit of hope about getting into the property market, that, the Great Australian Dream has been fading. I find it contradictory because I'm getting people into the market. So my view of the world is very skewed to success, but there's a whole cohort of Australians that feel dejected, and dejection leaves you on this very downward spiral going, this is never going to happen to me. And it's almost like you opt out at that point.
Correct. And look, politicians say they don't look at polls. That's a big lie. Politicians are always looking at polls because we're trying to understand what's happening in the community to complement our individual interactions with people. And for example, when we have meetings like we had in Kiama with builders, developers, mortgage brokers, and we know that people under 40 are going crazy about housing because they feel like there's no possible way that they're going to be able to buy a home, and they've done all the right things. They've done a trade, they've been to university, they've got a good paying job, and they can't crack a house. And so that is destroying in some cases, their mental health, because they want to provide that foundation for a family. It's also potentially hurting the ability of Australia to populate.
Oh, I'm glad you said that. That's a big part of going, hey, mate, if we're stuck in this apartment, we can't have more than one child, maybe two if we go to a townhouse, for example, so we can afford. And then it puts off families because, again, working to pay a mortgage requires two incomes as well.
So that's why we have a fundamentally different approach to the current government on housing, on the supply side and on the demand side. We think there are a number of things that can be done to get the Australian dream back on track.
Can you elaborate on what you think?
Yeah, so on the supply side, you need to build more houses. So under the last government, when we were in office, we built about 195,000 houses a year. Now we're down to 170,000 houses a year on average under Labor. And the problem with that is that they've let 1 million people into the country in the last 2 years. So you've had a massive influx of migration and a huge collapse in housing construction. That has really constrained the market. There are other factors as well, but ultimately you need to be building more like 250,000 houses a year to solve the housing crisis, and we're going backwards. So we have a $5 billion supply fund which would pay for last mile infrastructure, so sewage, water, roads, that's needed to unlock new supply. That is critical.
Yeah. Okay.
We're also going to try and cut the cost of building by freezing the construction code for 10 years. That's the supply side. On the demand side, we want to do a couple of things. Firstly, we want to tilt the scales for first home buyers by allowing them to use their own money in super. Using your own money in super is one of the best ways for millennials and Gen Zs to bridge that deposit cliff. It's the key test of their success in retirement in future. It's their own money, and it would make a material difference to bridging that massive deposit cliff. We also want to look at lending laws and look at how the current lending laws are retarding the ability of people to get that first home loan. Because as you know from your business,
Correct.
if you can't get a home loan, you can't get a first house.
Correct. There's so much there. Let's start with the last one,
Sure.
Relaxing lending laws. And it's
Yeah.
probably unintended consequences is a major thing what happens when you kind of tweak or play with lending. I've seen this, I've been in the game for a little while now.
Yeah.
So you had the restrictions around interest-only lending that came about. You had changes post-Royal Commission that came about as well. And it's almost like once you play with lending, you then inadvertently have a knock-on effect to the property market as well. So what does that look like? So I think one of the big discussions is around removing HEX, which I think, again, to your point, where you would encouraging young Australians to study and to then get into professional services or into the workforce. And now they're lumping around this like ball and chain of like $50,000, $60,000 plus on a student debt. What are the other ideas that you've seen that, again, whatever you can share publicly, what would move the needle from a lending perspective?
So there's two more things we want to do in the lending space. Firstly, there's the prudential regulator APRA.
Yeah.
They make all the rules, and they are a bit like a branch of government which doesn't really like to talk to people like me who are responsible for making sure that they're accountable and transparent.
Yeah.
And they make the rules which apply to people getting a loan from a bank, and they do it all without anyone really looking at what they are doing. So they're very – it's a bit like – so Elon Musk has described this sort of fourth branch of government where there's this deep state or this very bureaucratic system where all these people who haven't been elected to office are actually making all the material rules. So people who've never been voted into office are running the country, which is very concerning. And so in relation to how they set rules for mortgages, they have this thing called the serviceability buffer, which you know about through your business, which is set at 3%, even though we're at the top of a tightening cycle, and it was set at 3% when we're at the bottom of the cycle. And the only thing it can manage for is changes in the cash rate. It can't protect you from losing your job.
Yeah,
so having that as an arbitrary rate at 3% means they're trying to eliminate all risk, but they're doing that on the basis that they're trying to stop every single risk, including the ones they can't stop. And the pendulum has swung so far that now banks can't even take a risk on people they want to take a risk on. Yeah. And so if you have baby boomers, for example, who are listening to this podcast, when they got their first home loan, the bank was able to take a risk on them because they could probably project that in future their cash flow would increase.
Great.
But now that's not possible. So long story short, we want to change the way that APRA makes its rules. We also want to have a lower serviceability buffer for first home buyers.
Right. Yeah, I feel like you unlock that first home buyer part. You said that's the biggest hurdle. That's exactly what we say for us. The vernacular is, the second you can get into home ownership, the easier it is. It's not everyone has access to bank and mum and dad, which I feel is the ultimate divide between Australians. I'm not sure if you read Alan Kohler's quarterly essay as well. I mean, he breaks that wide open, and I think it was a fantastic piece as well, really talking to, I guess, the history of home ownership. So if you haven't read that, I'd jump in and even just get the executive summary on that one. But even in that book, it talks about it becomes a real political issue and a social issue. Is it government's responsibility? And there's a cohort of our listeners that are property investors, maybe even migrants that have come to this country and gone, we've had to do this off our own back without any government support. Is it the government's responsibility, or do Australians have a right to housing, do you think,
I mean,
without being tone deaf from our perspective?
In my job as a spokesperson for home ownership, I take a lot of meetings where people want to talk about issues that are relating to councils and states. And we don't do development approvals. We don't run the state. We're the federal government. So there are things that we cannot do. But we do run migration. We run banking. We run superannuation. We make payments to the states and also to other parts of the government. So we have a lot of levers which we can deploy and we must deploy. And if you go back and look at history of Australia, when the Menzies government came in 1949, Menzies, who was the founder of the Liberal Party, he inherited very high migration and very low housing construction. And so he cut sales tax on new builds. So he recognised the federal government had a role. Now, that is still the case today. The federal government must do everything it can to help on the banking policy side, superannuation, make sure that the states are doing the right thing. So we have a core role here of making sure that, and my mission is making sure that millennials and Gen Zs can change their trajectory and that they can become homeowners, because I think right now they are feeling like that Australian dream is slipping away. Yeah. So if we don't do nothing, we will guarantee that the Australian dream will die for millennials and Gen Zs, and certainly under the current Labor government, that's the trajectory we're on.
Yeah, fantastic. I love the mission, and I think where there's a will, there's going to be a way. There'll be, and I'm part of a lot of property associations, for example. Pippa's another one where I think we had this the other week.
Yeah,
I was sitting down with Evan Lucas. He's a economic futurist, and he was against, and we're going to bring him on in a future episode. He was against young Australians being able to access their super. And you probably get this resistance, not just exclusively from him, but a lot of people, financial planners, are very vocal that super is not to be used for housing, particularly owner-occupied as well. I mean, what's the research that I love the fact that you're shaking your head, because I love it. I think it's the deposit gap is 100% that's where the issue is. Incomes, but you don't have the deposit to get in.
We live in a country where people are free to say whatever they want, including a bunch of lies. And so the big super funds have a massive vested interest in keeping all our money, trillions of dollars, locked up so they can charge high fees on it. I think of them as like Dracula running the blood bank. Okay, so if I ask them, do they want to have more blood? The answer is yes, they want more. They want more blood. And so they have commissioned all sorts of dodgy research to show that the sky would fall in and the nation would fall into the sea if people were allowed to use their own money. Now, as you know from your property podcast, we have an $11 trillion property sector.
Correct.
Okay, $11 trillion. So even if all the home loans doubled for first home buyers and you had like 300,000 loans instead of 150,000 next year, you're still at like 0.06% of the market.
Yeah.
So you're massively immaterial. So all these lies that you hear from the super funds that the sky will fall in, it'll be the end of the world, is just baloney. And it is just desperate, self-serving, blood-sucking lobbying, which puts their interest first and the people last. So the key stat I like to recite is the average 38-year-old has 90 grand in their super.
No, this is exactly the argument.
So that's a sweet spot for the policy, right? So if you have, let's say you have two 38-year-olds who want to come together, they can get 100 grand, even in a market like Sydney. Now they're in the game compared to the other investors and everyone else. So it's a no-brainer. It's a great idea. It bridges that deposit cliff.
And is there, because then it becomes all sorts of, where they pull that money out of super, for example, do they have some type of fiduciary responsibility then to put that back into super at some point?
Well, that's our policy. But I mean, ultimately, you're better off over the long term.
Absolutely.
So you can look at all the historical projections and make your own mind up. But certainly for the actuarial analysis, which was done for the Senate last year, showed that for someone to take out their money in their 30s to buy a flat in Sydney, they're way better off than leaving that money in super. So, look, it's not my role to give people financial advice, but it is my role to defend what are reasonable policy suggestions. Now, my party's policy is you can take up to 50 grand from your super. And I think that is a game changer for first home buyers.
Yeah, thanks very much. And look, like I said, this discussion is purely agnostic to which political side you sit on. We're having a conversation, one, because you've been really generous with your time, but two, because I feel like there is a level of conviction that you personally have around home ownership. And it's probably something, when I looked at your YouTube, when I look at your socials, when we had the chance to meet, I was like, I can see there's a level of conviction here and belief that home affordability and housing affordability and home ownership should not be out of reach for younger Australians. And here's some ways that we can really open the door, move the needle. And that needs to be championed, that type of message. So I don't have any type of political agenda. So I hope that doesn't come across in that vein as well.
Look, I think it's fine. I think if the Labor Party was here today, I mean, they would say that they think that super is the best thing they've ever created and that it should be all locked up and that people are better off with their money in super and that there are other ways to solve the housing crisis. That's what I think what they would say. And they would say that we are very bad for proposing that people should open up their super. And the language they use is that they want people to raid their super. It's very hard to raid your own money. I mean, it's your money. So there is a philosophical difference here. And as you say, Aaron, at the election, people can make up their own mind. They'll have a smorgasbord of policies, okay? They'll be able to choose from Labor's policies, the Greens policies, which is where the government becomes a property developer, or they've got our policies, which are we are of the view that people can make up their own mind, and it's better to arm people with the capacity to make up their own judgments.
Yeah.
And so that's a philosophical difference. And I welcome a philosophical difference, and I welcome the facts. What I don't like is where the big super funds spend all people's money, which is money that they actually are given under a legislative mandate, to then go and commission dodgy research or do a whole lot of advertising, which is spruiking lies. I think that is really kind of quite corrosive. But look, we live in a democracy where people are free to say what they want, which is great, and I celebrate that. But I just point out that when they're doing this, they're using the people's money, which is supposed to be reserved for their retirement, to advocate for, frankly, craven self-interest.
Yeah, nice one. Nicely said. Thanks very much. The levers, you mentioned very well before around the levers that government can pull.
Yeah.
And, I mean, the RBA, again, like APRA said, external to your remit, but again, making decisions that influence the property market and lending.
Well, they're not external to our remit. The fact is that they've been established to make rules, but I think they've been given too much authority, too much delegated authority. And that's why I referenced the Elon Musk point before, which is that I think what he's saying is that you've got all these bodies making up the rules. None of these people have been elected. This is the same problem we have here, that they're making judgments which are so material to people's lives, and they've been given this authority by the parliament. So what I'm saying is when APRA sets a serviceability buffer, they need to think very carefully about the impact it has on first home buyers rather than just doing everything they can to eliminate all risk, because some risk is good.
Yeah, spot on. So we talked about migration. That's probably a big part. How does that sit in, I guess, your outlook for if you guys come into power? And that's obviously the floodgates were open. We welcome people into this country without probably the knock-on effect of what that meant for housing and the lack of supply that was there.
Well, there was an exchange we had at the Senate hearings 2 weeks ago where I asked the Treasury where was the modelling that they had produced for the 1 million people coming into the country and only building 160,000 houses a year.
Yeah.
Where's that modelling? Do you have that? They didn't have that modelling. And the Minister, Gallagher, said that it wasn't bad that they hadn't commissioned it. Now, I would have thought that's the first piece of research you want to have, because you want to understand how having more people is going to impact the housing market when it's already very constrained. So we've announced that we would reduce permanent migration, but there'll still be migration into Australia because we need people to be in our country because Australians can't do all the jobs that are required.
Right.
But it'll be a lower permanent migration level, which I think will ease their housing squeeze. But it's one of a number of measures to try and get supply moving. And the main supply measure is that $5 billion supply fund.
Okay. And again, I'm not a politician, but that $5 billion, is that how well has that been costed out? Is that a point where it's like, hey, look, will that be enough juice to squeeze to get going on essential services?
We think we can get another 500,000 houses out of it by building last mile infrastructure. And the way it will work is that a developer or a council would have to make an application to Canberra. This judgment would be made by a minister, not by a bureaucrat, about how many houses that they could potentially get if the federal government paid for a piece of sewerage infrastructure or a road, and then we'd get going. But what I've said to people in stakeholder meetings is don't wait for the election. Get going on what the proposals would be now, and in the event that we get the great honour of being the government, we want to get moving straight away. We want to get building. You know, we'll all walk around with our hard hats on and make sure that we're doing our best, because we also need to use the pulpit we have in Canberra, which is, as I said to you before, Aaron, we don't run the planning department, okay? But we can put the enormous moral clarity and moral weight of the federal government behind this agenda, because part of this agenda is about pushing back on NIMBYism. Because NIMBYism is corrosive, and if the NIMBYs win, then the Millennials and Gen Zs will pay. So I see our fund as doing two things. I see it being able to unlock new houses, but also giving the federal government an opportunity to bash down on NIMBYism.
Yeah, okay. So Senator Bragg, another big topic that comes out is the impact around negative gearing or taxes for property investors. Has there been any discussions around policies, positive, negatively, again, maybe the impact that has on property investors?
Well, mate, as you know, it's a red herring. I mean, and if I was the Greens here today, I'd say I can solve the whole property problem with tweaking negative gearing in CGT. I mean, I wish it was that simple. If only it was that simple. But that is absolute baloney. And if you abolish negative gearing in CGT, it would make less than 1% difference to the prices, or about 1% difference to the prices. So it's a massive red herring. And we don't think that increasing taxes on housing is the way to go. About half the cost of building a new house in Australia today goes in taxes and regulation. So why would we be trying to uplift the tax take on houses in a housing crisis? So we need to, this might sound a bit jarring or a bit kind of countercultural, but there's sort of a sense in politics that, property developers are these terrible, stinky people. We can't have anything to do with them. But the property developers and the builders and the tradespeople, these are the people that will solve the housing crisis. There's no other way. Unless you want to live in the Soviet Union or whatever the Greens want to turn Australia into, whether the government becomes the property developer, these are the only people, tradespeople, builders, developers, that can get you to 250,000 houses a year. So you've got to work out how you get that going. Increasing the taxes on them is not a good idea. That's going to get less houses.
Yeah, okay. And you mentioned before around the building code, like freezing the cost there. What is that from an implementation perspective? What does that look like, and how do you go about enacting that? Yeah,
so we have the National Construction Code, which is known to, I'm sure, some of your listeners, and that sets out the bare bones of how a house needs to be built in Australia. It's standards, okay? And the recent changes have meant that there are vastly more costs than there should be for some new builds. And so we've said there'll be a 10-year freeze on any changes to the NCC that would increase cost. And when we had the head of the construction code from the Commonwealth Department come to Senate estimates 2 weeks ago, I said to him, how many times have you met with the minister to work out how you could cut the cost of building? And his answer was zero. He'd never had a discussion about that. So we understand that cutting the cost of building is germane to making housing more viable. And this is also part of the supply fund. What's happening now is effectively the government is saying to builders and developers, you need to pay for street lights, footpaths, sewerage in some cases, build that cost into the development, and then charge the consumer. And then
make a profit in there as
correct,
well.
And then good luck trying to make a profit.
Yeah.
Good luck, right? And so when you talk to developers who want to build, they're like, well, we want to build a 20 or 30-story property here of flats, but it's unviable. It's too expensive. We can't make a buck out of it. Right. So we're going to do something else. So the infrastructure fund means that the government build the street lights, the sewage, the roads, whatever.
Yeah.
Okay? That's on us.
Yeah.
And then the construction code pause means that we are doing everything we can to cut more cost from the system, because we know that getting costs down is key to viability.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much. To jump back to another point around the first home buyer initiatives that you're looking at.
Yeah.
One of the feedback loops that we get is around the price caps that come on that. Now, is that set from a state level, for example? There's talks around New South Wales had the stamp duty that they were originally going to roll out as land tax. But then we'll get, particularly for Sydney, where you cut it off at, say, $1 million, for example, or no stamp duty at a certain threshold. People go, hang on, mate, if I want to buy my first home, and let's say, for example, we've got a combined household income of $250,000 and we can afford to buy $1 million, get a $1.8 million house. But now we've got cut-offs of support at certain income bands. Is there talks of, hey, how do we go about renewing this, because Sydney is a much more expensive market than potentially other markets in the country?
Well, the state Liberal Party had a system where you could take the stamp duty and pay it over a number of years.
Yeah.
But that's one of the first things that Labor abolished when they won the state election. So we think that was a good idea. We think that was helping. We would encourage our state parliamentary colleagues to look at that again if they're to form the next government and defeat the Minns government. But in Canberra, the only price caps I can think of really that apply to the day-to-day will be in relation to the home guarantee scheme, and then also in relation to the help to buy. So we've said we would abolish the help to buy scheme. That's going to cost the Commonwealth $5.5 billion. So we think that money would be better spent on building infrastructure.
Yeah.
And so we've already announced that. So we would abolish that scheme if we win office. As for the home guarantee scheme, that's something that we put in place. I think it's a good idea, but we also want to make sure we have a viable lenders mortgage insurance industry going forward. And one of the recommendations of a recent report was that we should look very closely at the arbitrage between the LMI offered by the private market and the home guarantee scheme, because insurance is a good product. If the private sector is doing it, that's good. And I'm an old-fashioned liberal, and I'd like to see the private sector do as much as it can and the government do as little as possible.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much. I guess there's a mentality as well. It's like, hey, it's a win-lose. Like, you help first-home buyers, and what about other segments, for example? I know there's so many renters that I don't know, are they suffering in silence, for example? They don't realise there's options. Like you said, there's the shared equity scheme, there's low deposit schemes, there's pay the LMI, for example. I know we're not going to be able to save everyone and throw out life rafts to save out everyone. How does, and again, it's really, I don't want to sound tone deaf where you go, hey, meet me halfway, but there's all these initiatives, there's all these offers, there's all these opportunities to get into the housing market. What's your message to someone? Say, hey, look, you got to put your hand up for a bit of help as well here and understand what's at your fingertips, because inadvertently you might be eligible for one of the benefits or the schemes or the or initiatives, but you can't suffer in silence. You've got to find a way to be a bit resourceful as well.
Well, Aaron, as you know, the problem here is we haven't built enough houses. That is ultimately the problem.
Yeah.
And so we need to build more houses. That will help everyone, because it will reduce the constrained supply problem.
Yeah.
So that is why we're not going to say there's 10 things we're going to do. There'll be a handful of things, right? So it'll be building those houses. It'll be constraining that unrestrained migration. Those are the important messages I would say to you. In terms of the eligibility of the schemes, I mean, these are designed to help people in a targeted way. But we would much rather people use their own money in superannuation than use a government scheme. We think that's a far more effective way of doing it, which is why that's our policy. And furthermore, we think there's a lot that can be done on the lending side. So the government programs are okay, but it's much better if we can calibrate it so people can use their own money.
Yeah.
And that we get the regulators thinking about how best to actually calibrate risk rather than just saying all risk is bad. So I think it's a bit more of a nuanced conversation than just having a bunch of government schemes. But as you know, the home guarantee scheme has been a very successful policy.
Absolutely. Yeah, I welcome. I mean, first-time buyer schemes have been around for quite some. My older brother bought, I think, when there was a $21,000 initiative. I bought when there was a $7,000 initiative. These were schemes that enabled us to get into the property market. And yeah, sure, they're never your forever home. It's a stepping stone to get you into the property market. I think that's probably the argument for where some of those price bands sit, going, we're not here to help facilitate someone's forever home. It's going, get into the market, buy what you can, where you can, when you can. And then at that point, there's a bit of rolling momentum to help you upgrade. And
once you're in, you're in.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. And I don't buy this argument, as I said to you before, that these schemes necessarily have destroyed the pricing. I mean, the pricing problem is a result of not having built enough houses. It's supply and demand. You've got an $11 trillion market. So, people using these grants and schemes, it's just not big enough to move the needle. It's immaterial.
Yeah.
It just is. And so I find this debate very irritating when you pick up the newspaper and someone says, super for housing will destroy the property market. I mean, I think it's very, very sloppy journalism in many cases. And unfortunately, we don't have the same sort of specialist journalism we have had in the past, which is why I suspect that your podcast and other podcasts are so popular now, because a lot of us actually want to get into the detail of the issue. They want to read more than just glib slogans and throwaway lines, which are sort of just done for advocacy and lobbying purposes.
Yeah, nice one. Well said. Well said. The sentiment before around, hey, there's better outcomes in retirement when you own your own home. I mean, I've done some research on it. What's your research shown up?
Well, you're hundreds of thousands of dollars better off if you take your money out of super, put it into an apartment in your 30s, than if you left it in the average balance fund. So that's very clear. And so then the key test of retirement success is your housing status. If you are a retired renter on the pension but with a big super balance, it's going to be a much harder retirement. So the super funds will spend all their time and money trying to tell you how good it is to have a big super balance. But the reality is it's your house that determines your economic status of retirement, your success in retirement. It also has the psychological benefits, which are very clear and obvious, that it could be a family home. It gives you stability. No one can take it away from you.
Great.
That's your house, and your house is more important than your super.
Yeah.
And so we are very proud of giving the Australian people a choice that they can have their house funded by their super.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, for most Australians, a very welcome opportunity that they will want to take every opportunity to use.
Yeah, nice. So that debate where you got an asset, which is your home, and then you got super, which is your cash, we see this time and time again where people might be asset rich but cash poor. Or it's the other way around. They hold, like you said, they're holding all the cash and they've got no asset to their name as well. From a modelling perspective, where's that sweet spot that you're saying, hey, people can have a really comfortable retirement, have the stability and security of having their own home, and then not being, I guess, effectively reliant on the government to buoy them through retirement as well?
Well, look, I have a pretty I'm not sure. I mean, I think the age pension underwrites most people's retirement in some way, and even by mid-century, most people will still take a pension of some form, part of full pension. So that's in 2050. That's after 70 years of super. There's no scenario where super ever replaces his pension. It never happens, which I always thought was very curious as to why do we have this scheme then?
That's exactly what I think, because I tell a lot of my peers, I'm like, I wouldn't, in my mind, I'm like, I would never rely on a pension because I've had super from day dot when I started working. So that's my, call it nest egg, or that's my way for future retirement.
But it doesn't replace the pension. It never does. And it's a very, very expensive system. So I think about it from a system point of view. I think that's more appropriate to my sort of role as a policymaker. So I think about it as a system, and the system never really pays off the taxpayer because of the ongoing age pension costs, and the system does provide significant tax incentives, which also is in the tax expenditure statement. It's not like spending $1, it's just reduced tax receipts for the Commonwealth government. So my view is, look, if you look to the mid-century, read the Treasury's intergenerational report, you'll see that most people are still on a pension. Question is how many are full, how many are part, and we want to make sure people have more choice. We think that choice is always good.
Yeah, lovely. Senator Bragg, as we wrap up, look, going into the election, first of all, good luck.
Thank you.
I feel like this is going to be an issue that's covered the two biggest topics, cost of living and housing affordability and the housing crisis that we have. So just, I mean, you've touched on the housing affordability and crisis, what your policies and what you're looking to do there. Cost of living, what type of relief is there in sight, do you think?
I think the energy costs have been very significant. I think for small businesses in particular, they've really battled with the regular compliance costs that small business face, plus escalating energy bills. So I think you'll see a real focus on the cost of running a small business, cost of running a household, the ability to get a house. I think those would be really significant issues. And then more broadly, you have, perhaps not in front of mind for every voter, but you have the geopolitical situation where you have a new and old US president embarking on what are quite unorthodox economic policies, particularly for Australia, which is an open trading nation. And then how that all falls out geopolitically, I think those issues will also be part of the debate during the election, because people look to the national government to protect the country as well. And, you know, if we do two things well, we are running the economy as well as we can, and we're protecting our citizens. So I'd say those would be some likely themes for the election.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, because I don't know, in my conversations as a punter, I feel like you could be very inward looking, going, hey, we've got to worry about housing affordability and cost of living. But when you've got to be outward looking, it's like, hey, there's a national economy here that we're trying to keep afloat and keep the wheels turning, particularly with international trade partners. Obviously, that's what's happening at a federal level. And I think there's, not volatility is the right word, but there's some key decisions to make to ensure that we become a key trading partner and keep those relationships intact at a global level as well, isn't it?
Yeah, we have to make sure that we don't entertain any form of protectionism. Tariffs for Australia have been very bad in the past. They'll be very bad in the future. We need to try to keep on diversifying our trade relationships. Look, we actually run a surplus with the US, a trade surplus, and so the tariff that is now going to be imposed on Australia is quite bewildering, actually. But we have to make sure we don't make any bad knee-jerk judgments, and work with everyone else to maintain free trade as much as possible. And we also have a very delicate geopolitical situation in our own region, which we need to be mindful of. So maintaining our partnership with the US remains very, very important.
Love it. Just last question. And I think you've got an incredible job and responsibility. How do you keep the energy up? Because, I mean, you'll be talking all day, you're in the spotlight. Every word that comes out, can be judged or misinterpreted, for example. It can't be easy doing what you do. This is not me blowing any type of smoke, for example. But just asking you as a senator, obviously comes great responsibility, for example. How do you manage your energy?
Well, firstly, I try to be honest and say, if I don't know about something, I'll find out the information and come back to you. So I only try and speak openly about things I really know about. In terms of maintaining energy, like anyone else, you try and eat the right food, try and get some exercise. Those things are very important if you want to be sustainable. And then really you've got to be focused on what your mission is. And I've been given the home ownership mission by my boss, which is one that I was very keen to do. And I talked to him about it before the appointment. So I'm very pleased to be working on housing. And so that keeps me going. But, if we didn't have a strong mission, I'm not sure I'd have the same energy level. So I'd encourage everyone to find their own mission, because that's very sustaining and can be very rewarding.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being generous with your time. And like I said, good luck with the campaign, and may the best team win. But let's put your best foot forward and all the very best.
Thanks, Aaron. Great to be with you.
Thanks for loving us. Hey, look, I said this conversation might be slightly different to what we cover off, but I think it's super, super important, because, like I said, the two biggest issues that face our country is cost of living and the housing affordability and the housing crisis that we face. And if we're not talking about this effectively with the sources of truth here, then we're having side chatter, which I don't think serves us well. So if you found this episode helpful, mate, leave us a message, drop us a DM. We're loving the feedback loops that do come in, and we'll continue to bring you, I guess, more thought-provoking episodes as we go out through this year as well. Thanks very much. We'll talk soon.